Okay, welcome part 2. Hopefully people hear my sound now. So I'll just give it a moment for people to join. Let me know if you can hear my sound and if you can hear me speaking. Oh, and there's Yuval.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Good morning.
I want to try to connect my mic and see if I can still hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me all right? You can. Okay, perfect. Because before they
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Well, looks like it's working. Perfect.
Great. You have a mic? Where's the mic? Oh, hidden. Cool.
Profesh.
Great. Yeah, super fresh. Well, welcome. So nice to see you.
Likewise.
And thanks for doing this live with me. It's been, I guess, a couple weeks since I saw you last. And yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation. I think there's a lot for us to chat about. But I think that as we're continuing to witness the unfolding of the genocide in Palestine, it's can be quite confusing and disorienting for the world that didn't grow up either in Jewish community or in Israeli community to understand what the hell is happening with people and how can people be enabling these levels of horror. So I wanted to have a conversation with you about that because I've been really appreciating the deep decolonial spiritual teachings you've been putting out there. Yeah. So welcome.
Yeah. Thank you for having me and suggesting this idea. I feel like there's sorry, so many inner impulses to share. Like I see people talking about Israeli society and just the level of psychopathy, the level of the desire for domination, and just so many anecdotes from my own life growing up there come up for me, like just these little things, like in the molecular level of the society. So I was like, fuck yeah, that's a good idea. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, and one thing I appreciated you said is that every time we talk about it publicly, we also disempower it on some level. And I think that that's really true because, for me, I grew up in Jerusalem and went to Israeli schools and stuff until I was 10. And there was like this huge amount of fear around, right, speaking out against your people, against your community, and feeling like I'm the only one. And then when you kind of rupture that, you actually find that a lot of it is kind of like leaving a cult, where you're just like, oh, there's other people who see what I see, who have experienced what I've experienced, who see the level. I mean, I don't even know of what to say about it, but just the levels of like lies and deception that exist. And yeah, I think for me, it's always comforting to find people who also grew up within those systems and rebelled against them. Um, so maybe for the folks and people who are joining on the live, feel welcome to introduce yourself and share where you're tuning in from. And yeah, but maybe for the people who don't know you, why don't you introduce yourself and share a little bit about who you are and your background and how you got to doing this work for Palestinian liberation.
Sure. Also, I want to check in because someone is cutting the grass outside. Do you hear background noise or is it just me?
I don't hear anything.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to introduce myself in the context of this conversation. So I'm coming from a family of a mix of Palestinian, Moroccan, Syrian Jews, but also Holocaust survivors from Germany and Poland. So kind of like a perfect mix of all of the stratas of Israeli society. I grew up in Israel. I was in the Israeli occupation forces as artillery. I was probably the worst soldier ever in the IOF. I was always like rebelling against every single thing and constantly like bugging my my commanders about every single thing that I saw that I thought is unjust or just stupid. Therefore, I spent most of my service doing kitchen work. Then after that, I just basically the moment I left there, I started traveling the world. I've been traveling the past 12, 13 years, more or less. And over time, changed a lot of things in what I'm doing. I worked in a bizarre array of professions. In the past 5 years, more or less, I started just sharing some of my thoughts, writing more specifically around the areas of love, relationships, sexuality, eroticism, which as someone who grew up in very orthodox or come from a very orthodox background was something that was really dear to me. But I was always an anti-Zionist, more outwardly expressed in the last 10 years since I left Israel. But I never really spoke publicly about my opinions. It's just like conversations with people around me, with friends, but it's only in the last year of this genocide that I felt like the level of psychopathy that I observed growing up there reached the inevitable level that we are seeing right now, this boiling, explosive level right before it collapses, hopefully in our lifetime. And so, I just felt compelled to start talking, and that's what brought me here. The last year has been a wild ride. I met a lot of incredible people like you who shared this path of speaking truth to power and turning the grief and the pain and our specific, unique experiences as ex-Israeli Jews with people and allow it to influence the work that we are doing. So it's been devastating, full of grief, but also incredibly inspiring and heartwarming to connect with so many beautiful people.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm remembering when we met in person, one of the first conversations we had is that I spoke Hebrew with you, and you were like, actually, I don't want to speak Hebrew. I don't know if you remember that. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about that journey of like both like leaving Israeli society, of like being kind of disgusted by it and not wanting to have anything to do with it, and then also being like, all right, but maybe it's actually my responsibility in some ways to transform it also because it is where we come from. So yeah, I'm curious to hear a little bit of how you hold both of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this journey was just in general coming from Western adjacent society that is revolving around individualism and consumerism, in which politics is somehow something that is either politicians, which we all collectively hate, or just something uncomfortable that you just don't talk about, like separated somehow from life. And so I lived most of my life aware to certain degrees of what's happening in the world, especially climate catastrophes, something I've been following at least in the past like decade, pretty nerding pretty deeply about it and knowing what's going on. But I never felt like what I'm feeling right now, how every single aspect of my life is deeply political. The way that I show up in relationships, the way that I show up sexually, the way that I do work and share my labor and get paid for my labor, and the way that, you know, my heritage, my ancestral, my spirituality, like every single one of these things is deeply political. And I feel like for me, at least, this is the gift of Palestine, and especially the last year that kind of really woke me up to how much it's all connected. And it's what brought me to speak. And I think on top of that, there is also specifically something that is in Israeli society, that is this incredible sense of separation, not just physical separation, that you are completely detached deliberately from any kind of Palestinian experience of what's actually happening on the ground, but also inwardly, you are separated from any sense of how your life, your choices, your words, the way that you carry yourself are connected to and deeply intertwined with other people's fates. There is this like psychotic weird Israeli bubble in which people live in these super comfortable, super shiny lives in the middle of atrocities on top of another people, completely unaware of what's going on. It's insane. And so, yeah, it took a lot of time to come to terms with how big it is and really start to deconstruct it from my life. And it's still an ongoing process. It's not, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, and the bubble of which you're speaking, right? It's not just on the land, but it's also in all these different communities. Like even, recently we were in Portugal together, and I think something that I'm constantly struck by in a group of meeting Israelis is just how deep discomfort at best and at worst, just deep dehumanization there is of Palestinians, where there is in some ways also like the narrative bubble of not actually understanding Palestinian stories, not actually understanding Palestinians as people, not being interested in that, and somehow still identifying in some ways as this like liberal person in the world, and the ways that I mean, it's such a mind fuck, and I think it's been a mind fuck for me for my whole life. I mean, also in Jewish community in the US, where on the one hand, right, there's this whole, oh, we value life, we teach justice, we teach all of these things, but then when it comes to Palestine and Palestinians, it's just incredible manipulative dehumanizations that gets to a point of really like psychotic states of being, where you're just like, how did you get there when you're saying that these are your values? So I'm curious, yeah, to hear a little bit more about what you see in that dynamic, like how you see some of these patterns playing out.
I'll give you an anecdote that came up as you were speaking. There is an Israeli Zionist that I see from time to time where I live here. Not very often, like I saw him twice, just in public events. And he's wearing kufia. And first time that I saw him, I didn't know who he is. And I was like, oh, nice. Like, I felt like, okay, there's maybe some sense of camaraderie here, I was like, oh, wow, you're wearing kufia. Yeah, da-da-da. Sparked a conversation just to really quickly discover that the guy has no fucking clue what this even symbolizes. And went on to be incredibly prejudiced against Palestinians and very like Zionist, as you would expect from any Israeli, from the left, from the right, doesn't fucking matter. And I think this symbolizes really perfectly some of the Israeli psyche, that on one hand, majority of which, if not completely coming from Arab heritage, then at least half or some percentage, there is barely people who are 100% Ashkenazi in Israeli society. Not only do they live in the middle of the most Arab region in the world, surrounded by Arab countries, Arab-speaking countries. And obviously, the realities of occupation, the reality of Palestinian people, this symbol of their resistance, and being completely, not just unaware, but really perceive themselves as Europeans of some kind, as like American society. And then go around, travel the world, meet Palestinians, meet people, have conversations, and nothing changes their mind, nothing moves them anywhere. And it was nowhere more apparent to me, or like really, I mean, growing up in Israeli society, and the moment I finished with my service in the IOF, when they cut my soldier ID, I flew, and I never came back to fully live there. So I always knew that something is psychotic and deeply sick in Israeli society. But it was nowhere more apparent to me than in the last year, when I saw people that I considered my friends, people who considered themselves not just liberals, but hardline leftists. I'm talking about well-read people, not just people who pretend to be leftist and they actually liberal. I'm talking about people who are well-read, well-educated, read all of Marx, like talk about liberation for all of their life. Until it comes to Palestinians. Suddenly this whole thing started, and I heard the most deplorable, genocidal, inhumane, barbaric things coming out of these people's mouth. And I think this is just kind of like a beginning of scratching the surface of what Israeli society is actually like. And I think a lot of it, yes, a lot of it is education, obviously, and dehumanization of Palestinians from a very young age in very kind of pronounced ways. It's the messaging everywhere. It's the propaganda. Of course, all of these things are true, but I think there is kind of like passions and desires, like collective paranoid impulses that are deeper than those things. I think there's a combination of things. Of course, there is the animated force of grief that permeates through the ages, this untouched, fully acknowledged, unhealed grief that the Jewish people are still carrying with them, that now turned into creating grief for others. But also there is this sense of, I don't know if it's compensation for the discrimination and oppression that many European Jews have experienced for generations. I don't know what is this, but there is a sense of domination, a desire to dominate. There is, you're being fed with these ideas from a very young age in Israel that we are the smartest, the most brilliant, the most worthy, the most beautiful and sexy,
The most
the most
peaceful,
the most
like also where,
peaceful, the most
yeah.
democratic, the most forward-thinking, the most technologically advanced, the most everything,
Yeah.
which is insane because it's objectively have no. I mean, it has. I can understand it because it has some ground. There is definitely over the last decade sense most moral. Daniel said totally. um, they can say in the same sentence, "We are the most moral," and then yeah, let's kill them all, and there is no civilians or no innocent people in Gaza, and they
Yeah,
don't even
like
see the fucked upness in it, like.
like the classic, like, yeah, we really just want peace, so let's turn Gaza into a parking lot. And it's
Yeah.
like those two things don't add up.
So I think it's this really deep desire for domination, for being the best, for being above, that really drives Israeli society. And you see it also in the discourse. There is absolutely zero humility. It's all domineering. When Zionists come in my comment section, there is no conversation. Like, even though I don't attack them personally, they come and attack me, my looks, my Jewish heritage, my everything. Just like the most horrific things that have been wished upon, which I would never wish on anyone, even these people who are witnessing committing these atrocities. It's just not something that I would do as a human being. But I feel completely comfortable doing that because it's again coming back to the sense of domination. They don't want land, they don't want money, they don't want more, they don't necessarily want to annihilate Palestinians, I don't think, in their minds. They just want to be the best. They want to dominate. It's like a power
Yeah.
play. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add to that because it's like the domination, but then there's also this added like desire for vengeance, which is also so deeply ingrained. And it's like, so it just doesn't feel like just about the domination. It's also like the pleasure of that. And I think that's where you start seeing all these like really sick videos of just torture, and like you see Israelis just enjoying seeing Palestinians in pain. And yeah, there's something like that feels so, I mean, grotesque. And obviously, like, I oftentimes, for me, when I see some of these videos coming out of Gaza, it's just like I feel intense like disgust in my system. And then it's like all of that is washed on this layer of just, but we really want peace, and we really want equality, and we really are the smartest one, and we really are. And it really is. I mean, I keep just thinking of like how much of a mindfuck this is, because it's also like, yeah, I think something that I also contend with a lot. I mean, I think this is in Jewish community at large, but obviously also extreme within Israeli society, is that we're not talking about people who are not educated or read, you know. It's not, some of them even like read Edward Said in like, you know, universities, but somehow cannot integrate that and apply that. And yeah, I think like one of the questions that we kind of got in advance is this question of, well, how much is it even capable of being transformed, you know, Israeli society? Like, how much is it something that we need to transform, or is it just impossible at this level because it's gotten to levels of just intense cruelty and um, yeah, I think part of what I also sit with is that level of what you were speaking about, of just like having all of this happening in the background of that intense desire to dominate, and then almost like pretending that that's not happening, right? This like, and then it's like unclear. It's like, well, are you aware of what's going on? Are you not aware? And you know, yeah. And sorry, I'm going off, but like I'm just thinking of like, you know, so often like Israelis like refuse to actually see what's happening in the West Bank, but at the same time, they really enjoy this like fantasy of greater Israel and taking over land. And they're like, oh no, like what's happening in the West Bank is just extremist settlers. But then they are also like really enjoying this Yani prophecy of like the greater Israel. So like all these contradictions that make it really hard to like, well, how do we work with that? You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, it's the whole existence of this state, of this made up state, is one big massive set of contradictions. Like nothing makes sense, and you feel it also like anecdotes in day-to-day life, like how I remember one of the things, even before I was so politically aware as I am right now, when I lived in Israeli society, I always felt so stressed. Everybody are so aggressively stressed all the time, and you feel it everywhere. You're standing in lines and people push you, and like you go, like in Israel, going into a bus, there is no line like in every other civilized place in the world. There is just cramming into the thing, pushing each other. Everything feels like a competition. Everything feels like uh, um, intensity. And people are deeply aware of that. They just don't get where it comes from. And of course, now that I'm looking back, I have the context for it. But like when you look back, when I look back, I see that of course you'll all be constantly intense and stressed and like dysregulated nervous systems. Your sheer existence is, and the fact that it's so privileged and so comfortable is because you're being paid by US taxpayer dollars and living on top of the resources, land, and life of another people, of Palestinian people. Of course, you're going to be intense all the time. Of course, you're going to be, you know. And I think you touched something really beautiful with it's not that the lack of education, and it's true. I mean, of course, there are also a lot of illiterate, deplorable idiots. Of course, nobody can deny that. But there are so many people who are really well educated, like you said, even read the books that we are reading. It's almost as if, yeah, I think the human psyche is made out of more than just what we know. It's not just about knowledge. You know, there are deep passions and desires and molecular flows that make us who we are, that change us, and also on a collective level that flow through and create a society and move a society and deterritorialize and reterritorialize a society. And part of those flows, I think a lot of it is a lot of privilege. For example, a great anecdote is I've been trying to come to terms and analyze that for the past year. One of my friends who was deeply educated, really knowledgeable, and I remember having conversations with him for years exactly about these topics. And I know where he stands. I know what he knows. We spoke about the occupation. We spoke about the blockade in Gaza. We spoke about Israel as a colonial, settler colonialist project. Come October 7th, and he's talking about volunteering to going to fight.
Oh.
And matter like, and then that's not just the first week of like, you know, you said, okay, he was like, you know, October 7th, it was atrocious, it was played out and exacerbated and amplified in the media and made out of this crazy manufacturing consent propaganda campaign. Okay, no, still a year later, still talking the same way, no matter what I sent him, no matter what we spoke about. And literally like a few weeks after October 7th, posted this super long post, proper propaganda shit. And we're just trying to understand how, like, what in the psyche makes someone behave like that. And I think it's a combination of a lot of things. It's a lot of fears. It's a lot of generational trauma, unacknowledged. It's also a lot of privilege. I think we are talking about people that over the last couple of decades went from being in their 20s, rebellious, you know, kind of communist, socialist adjacent, well-educated, pretty broke, into upper class people, made a lot of money, bought apartments. Suddenly they have apartments in Jaffa and Haifa and this and that, and they have a lot to lose.
Yeah.
And I think that plays a big part into all of this. It's an extremely individualistic, it's extremely consumeristic culture. It's like the United States when COVID hit and people almost killed each other for toilet paper. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's so, yeah.
Yeah. And part of what you're naming there is like something that I get really sad over, specifically around Arab Jewish identity. And obviously there's multi layers around this, but part of what we see with these communities in Israeli society is just turned pure capitalistic. Like we just lost so much of our culture of devotion and prayer and music and art. And, you know, like Arab Jews used to create some of the most beautiful art in the world. And now it's kind of like a lot of that is just going into like pure capitalism in the Israeli state. And of course, obviously connecting to also the oppression Palestinians are facing. But yeah, the destruction of also like who we are as people, you know, and obviously so many anti-Zionist Jews, whatever their lineages and identities are, it's like that is part of being anti-Zionist, is like excavating like what was actually lost and who actually were we before Zionism, before like Zionism kind of twisted and morphed us into this. And yeah, I don't know. It's just it's so tragic. Like it's just so tragic. And I think for me, it's like because I resonate with what you're saying of Israeli society just being so on edge all the time and also so angry. Like there's like this deep anger, this deep, of course, trauma that then clouds everything that's happening to Palestinians. You know, it's constantly overshadowing it, and it's like hard to also like for people to actually contend with Palestinian narrative and Palestinian story on its own terms. That's a very hard thing for a lot of, you know, Israelis and Jews to do, because it's constantly like, well, the Holocaust was intense and and our pain and this and that, and it just constantly overshadows Palestinian experience. And it's like, well, how is that even any equal ground to even have a conversation, let alone be partners in some transformation? Yeah. And I see that, you know, I think it's also in like some of the shared spaces that we've been in together, where it's like, even when there is a commitment to doing something different, some of these dynamics come about, as you said, they're like super molecular, they're ingrained, or, you know, in our psyches. There's these like ways of being that need to be contended with. And there's not a lot of mirrors, right, for people holding up the mirror to be like, what is going on here? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned earlier something that touched on something that I'm still in a process of exploring, and I wrote a piece about it on eros and violence, trying to touch these very hard to speak about topics because they are, first of all, very dark, but second of all, touch very deep and insane parts of our all of our psyches, right? Like for me, the importance of understanding better and learning and figuring out and deconstructing the psyche of the colonizer and the empire as a whole is for us. It's not like them, the evil ones. Like if we are not all content with this, the Nazi, Zionist, fascist within, which exists in all of us and shows up in leftist circles, in activist circles, and in who we are on a day-to-day life, like the same passions, desires, pleasures, masochistic, all kinds of stuff, then we have a problem, you know, and then we're going to repeat the cycle again and again and again. So I feel like part of that work and the ability to reimagine something different is really better understanding it. So when you spoke about the pleasure part of it, is something that I'm not fully, I haven't fully kind of figured out. I don't think I ever will, but it's something that I'm trying to, there is a piece that I wrote about it, it will come out soon, but, and I think I barely touched the surface, but the pleasure part, it's so ingrained. This is not just about the extreme right-wingers who drive pleasure in this psychopathy. This is about all of Israeli society. There is a sense of pent-up aggression. It's erotic. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure that exists in the psyche, in the collective psyche, in the personal psyche, with the ideas around the annihilation of the Palestinian people. And I think it's also connected to domination, which connects to this masochism, sadism, sadistic, masochistic kind of relationship. And you know, and I'm saying sadistic, masochistic because like the masochistic is like, yes, the way in which the Israeli society received October 7th with a lot of grief, but also in some way like as if some fantasy is being fulfilled. The way that they all jumped into making this rape-crazed, beheaded, like all kinds of it's fantasies. It's erotic fantasies that they have in the psyche of like being experiencing these atrocities and dying for this idea of Zionism, but also then of course enacting atrocities. And I heard that from people like in my life that are leftists, did psychedelics, talk about love and light and do all the spiritual stuff and did ayahuasca and all of the shit. And when you live with them, like I know them for 10 years, like they have genuinely loving, genuinely caring capacities, just like all of us. They've been in great relationships. They share a lot of love in the world. They care about stuff. They care about other people. They care about a lot of things, right? This is what's important for me to emphasize, that it's like people like you and I. It's not something happening somewhere out there. But then came October 7th, and like I'm eating dinner with a friend in where I was staying, and we were like talking about it. In my head, I was like, oh, of course we're on the same page. Like this guy lived a similar life to what I lived, walking a similar path, cares about similar things. Of course we're on the same page. And then he said, yeah, I don't give a fuck. As far as I'm concerned, they can all be thrown to the sea. And I was so shocked by it in that moment. And it's been a year of unfurling a lot of that kind of psyche. And I think it comes back to like, when I'm looking back at the way that he said it, not just what he said, which can be a molar aggregate of all the propaganda and the narratives and the particular ways of speaking about Palestinians that he learned from a very young age, but I'm talking about the molecular part of it. There was pleasure there. And that's something really, really, really dark and really psychopathic. But also very, very important to think about and to meditate on and to grapple with and to study and to reflect on where we are there. You know?
No, that's super deep. And I see that really strongly. And I think so often, I mean, sexuality is just so embedded into politics in general all the time, but specifically in this context, it's just, um, yeah, like the conversation gets either it gets sexual real fast, or like sexual abuse, and as you were talking about the way rape stories, like a lot of that just becomes so central. And yeah, I think, I was thinking as you were speaking, that it's almost like the fantasy. I mean, there's so much fantasy built into that, right? There's kind of that pure biblical religious fantasy of like, wow, we're God's chosen people and we get this land, and how like the kind of pure, or I guess you could say light version of it. And then there's kind of that dark stuff where it's like, I feel that part of that psyche is the way that we know ourselves as Jewish people is through abuse. And we kind of want that, we want that to prove to the world that it's what we were saying about our oppression is true, and there's a way in which it's like, even that narrative of like, everyone hates us, we can't, like, there's also something there that it feels, and it feels edgy to talk about even publicly, I'll just admit it, because these are things that are, I feel, deeply hidden in the psyche, in the ways in which when we say certain things, they're actually coming from deeper desires. But yeah, it feels like this, like whenever people are like, everyone hates me, there's also in some ways like this desire to experience that. And then in some ways, whether it's conscious or unconscious, like a creation of circumstances that generate that exact sensation, right? So it is a lot of masochism and sadism, and that whole dynamic is just so present. And again, it's just like on top of that, there's kind of this whole whitewashing of just like, oh, but really the Israelis are really the ones who are wanting peace, and look at these like barbaric, uncivilized Palestinians and Arabs who are just constantly being like, how could you make peace with terrorists? Or so often that's where the conversation goes, that just completely invisibilizes all these layers of Israeli psyche.
Yeah, and even the trauma itself is eroticized in the psyche. Like, what comes to mind as you were speaking and I'm reflecting on it is like this image of like the intense, aggressive, wounded, traumatized ex-soldier
Mm-hmm.
that is so prevalent in Israeli society, because everybody are either before, in the middle, or right after and going to reserves. Like everybody are soldiers.
Yeah.
There is this almost a archetype that is very prevalent of this kind of traumatized, aggressive, like having nightmares, PTSD, but also like this super cool, very like sexy man. It's usually male.
Yeah.
And it's that this eroticization of trauma. The generational trauma of the Jewish people, the current trauma. And yeah, it's really edgy to talk about those things, but there is an element of sexualization of blood, of pain, of trauma, that recycles through the collective psyche and comes out as this what we are seeing right now. And I think, yeah, it's a big part, and it's not talked about as much. Like most of the conversation evolves around the molar parts of it, like the concentration of power and the propaganda and the words and the narratives and the historical context and all of that. And all of these things are very important to deconstruct. But I think if we really want to deconstruct Zionism, we need to speak about the hidden molecular aspects of it just as much.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, because ultimately, money, power, like all of these are deeply connected to the arrows, right? And the sexual impulse is just so strong, and when it gets twisted, it's like, yeah, we get into what we see today. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's just like also this. element of just horror of watching it all unfold and being like, well, where's the pause button, or where, because, on the one hand, it's like all this content that we're talking about, like on the one hand, it's like, okay, well, if we were in the therapist office or if we were in a communal healing circle, like that's a lot of energy and content to work through that could be done in this beautiful healing of service way. But when it is being played out through literal genocide, it's kind of like, well, what is the ways to, like, whether that's even just with holding conversations with people or the public discourse, like how do we neutralize these impulses that are leading to so much
Yeah.
destruction, so much joy in the destruction, right? So much celebration of the destruction. And it's almost like I go back and forth because I'm like, is it coming from a place of dissociation for Israelis that they can't actually feel the impact of it, which is part of why it just continues, or it's the opposite, where it's actually like maybe they actually feel the impact and then they actually are finding that pleasure again in that, and that joy in it, which is also disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, they don't feel the impact as much as people under oppression do, but they do feel the impact, like in their pockets, in their businesses, in their day-to-day kind of increased sense of tension and fear. And I mean, there has been first intifada, second intifada. It's not
Yeah,
that Israeli society is completely foreign to violence and to fear and to having either relatives or family members who were sacrificed at the altar of this psychotic regime in the army, or people who died in all kinds of attacks. I think, yeah, I think it's more the other thing that you said. I think it's more unconsciously, but loving it,
mm-hmm.
relishing in it, like celebrating. It's this like the real sense of virility and sexiness in this. I remember also like a lot of times, like every time there is like a war, which is basically a seasonal thing, growing up in Israel, you don't feel it as much because you have the Iron Dome and all of these protections, blah blah blah. You don't feel it as much, but nevertheless, like for a European, for example, who comes to stay in Tel Aviv and there is like sirens going off every 5 minutes, it's incredibly traumatic and scary. And I remember this, like how the narrative for me and around Israel is, I'm like, oh, no, we're used to it, it's fine. And it almost, but nothing like, oh, we are so poor. It's, no, like, almost taking pride
Yeah,
in it. And I think also it's the same on October 7th, with all of the atrocities, with all of the, even if all of their psychotic fantasies were real about the beheaded babies and the amount of rape that happened there and the mutilations and all these things that were debunked since, even if it was real, when you see people talking about it, you can see, if you really observe, you can see the fantasy,
yeah,
you can see the pleasure in that pain. You can see the, like, yes, like it's like the fulfillment of a pent up existing molecular desire that exists there, to be subjugated, to experience pain, to experience this trauma. So yeah, I think we have to touch that thing, to unfurl it, for Israelis, but also Jewish people in general, which, let's face it, we have a Jewish supremacy problem, we have a Zionist problem. There is no way around it. In order for us to come out of that, we have to touch that unconscious thing and bring it, like, why are we wearing this badge of sufferer, the ultimate sufferers, with so much pleasure? Like,
yeah,
maybe it's time to let go of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, of course, this has been talked about extensively in so many people and books, but just the way that Zionism killed this concept of like the weak Jew. Like will not let ourselves be the weak Jews, because that means the gas chambers. So, we'll be strong and strong and strong and strong. And I was just teaching a class about this because, we're kind of in this time of high holidays, and the prayers of prostration, which is right, kneeling and bowing your head to the ground, how in some ways that place of prayer is just completely oppositional to the militaristic stance of like being strong, being erect, looking around, like constantly gazing where your enemy is and what. And I think part of what we've lost by, this, we will never be weak again. We will just constantly have this strength and might and strength and might and strength and might. We actually lost, our vulnerabilities, but also our connection to God, which is like the thing that ultimately, obviously I'm a God lover, so like that's the ultimate thing that nourishes us. And I think that's part of, for me, how I started coming into anti-Zionism in the first place, is realizing that like what I was actually studying in Judaism and in Jewish ritual was completely absent in the Israeli state. Like it was almost like we're talking about two different Judaisms, right? Because the Judaism that I find in the Hebrew Bible is one about deep surrender and humility and following God to unknown places. And, even the Hebrew Bible just says multiple times, like, if you spill blood on this land, I will kick you out, right? God's like saying that. God's like, if you're gonna desecrate this land, like, then you don't belong here. And it's always so wild to me to read these things, to connect to Judaism on this level, and then look at the news and see soldiers reading Torah to blindfolded and handcuffed Palestinians who are lying on the ground. Like, it's just such a, it's just so sick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also this kinky, sadomasochistic kind of relationship that people have with God, with religion, with, this like, also it exists a lot in Catholicism and in Christianity as well, like the sense that to suffer is somehow good. Yeah, to be fair, there is also in the Jewish Bible a lot of genocidal stuff as well, and a lot of violence and whatever, slavery and whatnot. But yeah, I totally agree, and also from personal experience, there is such a vast traditions in Jewish mysticism, in Jewish thought. So many revolutionaries, so many academics as well. There is such an incredible lineage of Jewish academics who were anti-fascist, anti-Zionist, really revolutionaries. And yeah, it's really sad that this has been co-opted by, but I think beyond being saddened and heartbroken by that, I think at least where I channel my heartbreak is to trying to understand it, trying to understand it, and trying to understand it within myself and within people around me that I'm witnessing. And like we started the conversation with, the more we speak about it, the more we expose it, the weaker it gets. It's like when you are in a relational dynamic with someone on an interpersonal level, which is something anyone can relate to. Sometimes there is tension building up in the dynamic, which comes up in all of these kind of bursts of fighting and arguments about things that are not even related to the original thing that it comes from. And once we get into a vulnerable conversation and we get to touch the bottom of the thing, what is actually on my heart, then we bring it to the light. It stops controlling our behaviors. And I think it's the same on a bigger level, on the empire level. The empire have power as long as it goes in the shadows. But now everybody fucking knows. 50 years ago, not everybody knew that America is the most horrific empire that has ever been on this earth. Now everybody knows.
Not everybody. Hopefully.
Yeah, but like it's something that is a lot more available, a lot more, it's less radical to say, it's a lot more like out there, and it's just getting more and more, and to me that gives me a lot of hope and excitement for what we can co-create and rebuild together.
Yeah, man. Okay, we have a few minutes. So nice to see so many people using the chat. I don't know if folks have questions or comments. Feel welcome to join in. Is there anything we haven't chatted about that you want to share, Yuval?
Um, yeah, not in particular. I think I I shared most of what I wanted to. Yeah, Israeli society is a trip. It's a trip. I don't think we can fully cover it and all of the nuances and anecdotes in one conversation, but yeah, I hope we've done a useful job here.
Yeah. Someone was like so down for the kink Zionism conversation. Hi, Mira. um, how do we arrest Netanyahu? Yeah.
I mean, by the
Yeah, this,
way, we have the same pleasure, right? Like, look at this, like the way, and I notice in myself as well, the way that I speak about Zionists and how stupid and how fucking vile and how dark and all this is. This gives us pleasure too,
yeah,
and we
100%.
have to be really, really honest and really careful that we don't become the same thing. That we notice the same kind of sadomasochistic pleasure, dominance, like the inner fascist,
Hmm.
as the Luz and Guattari call it. And it's really, 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 really important. Like I see it in myself. I'm not just preaching to other people. Like
Yeah,
I drive weird kinky pleasure almost from dunking on
yeah,
Zionists. And I'm not saying we should not have any guilty pleasures. I'm not saying that I'm not enjoying it or will never do it again. It's okay that we have some joy in all of this, but noticing it,
yeah,
noticing where we are becoming more conscious and where we are othering and where we are becoming the fascist, and speak in ways that call for other people's annihilation,
hmm,
however much they are psychotic, however much we disagree with them, however much we hate what comes out of their collective neurosis and psychosis. Yeah, I think it's
yeah.
important.
Uh, just because a few people already asked, yeah, this will be recorded and I'll put it on our pages. But just to respond to that, um, yeah, I mean, and maybe this is part of my fantasy, but like something I think about often, and there's actually a play I'm gonna go see about this of, um, going back to the 40s, what would have been a more appropriate way for the Jewish people to heal, or and I don't even know if healing is the right word, but like post-Holocaust, like what is the way to be with genocide to the way that it doesn't end up getting ingrained in your mind, that you end up perpetuating it again, right? Like where is that stopping break point? And obviously this is like this ongoing question. But yeah, I think it's that is part of the question that I hold, and that's for me has been part of my journey into spirituality actually, and to God, because I was like, okay, there must be another way to deal with this level of extremism in our psychology, right? Like we can't just let that play out in this human world. Like there needs to be some wider container, deeper intention as to like what is going on, who we are, and ultimately, like for me, where I've come to is that relationship to God or that divinity is the thing that allows us and gives us the space to process some of these more intense psychological dynamics that exist within us. But when we don't have that, I often find that it ends up being suppressed in the psyche because people feel either shame or fear about it. And then it ends up, being really amplified and projected, and then there's a cover up of like, well, I'm a good person, I'm a good guy, I'm a good woman, like, and that structure, that rigid structure of thinking of ourselves as good is covering up. I mean, and these are just human things, right? All humans do this. It's not like this is just the Jewish story, right? But there's this kind of the consequences in the psyche of what happens when we don't confront what truly lives inside of us.
Completely. Completely. And it shows up in so many different ways. It shows up as leftist Zionists who are so bought into the identity with being good, with being humane, with being leftists, that they can't even see their own fascism. It shows up as, you know, looking at certain people from certain identities, like a black woman can do no wrong, and therefore let's put a clearly genocidal woman in power.
Yeah.
Just because she's black and a woman. Yeah, it perpetuates, and there is nothing that protects specifically Palestinians from becoming that. There is nothing, just like Jews are not the chosen people, Palestinians are neither. Like, there is no chosen people. There is just human beings, and we are all just as strange, just as fucked up, just as prone to fascism, and just as, of course, desiring liberation, you know. And
Yeah.
a lot of, like, it's important to understand, and it's something that I suggest people read the work of Derrida, Deleuze and Guattari, Foucault, like people who really explore these kind of cycles, the molecular flows.
William Reich. You read William Reich?
No.
He has a whole book about fascism and sexuality. It's very
They quote them in their books, Deleuze and Guattari especially, but I haven't read his stuff, only secondhand through them. But it's exactly that.
Yeah.
It's how, even when you look at Israeli society, this is an attempt for liberation. It just went rogue. It's the same impulse, co-opted by hegemony, co-opted by unconscious molecular flows, co-opted by all kinds of fantasies, co-opted by a lot of things. And it's the same thing exists within us.
Yeah.
You know, we can be all for liberation and anti-fascist and be very fascist in the way that we act, whether it's in the movement itself or towards other people in the movement. Like, there can be people who are very abusive in activism circles. So be so for Palestinian liberation, but treat women in their life like shit.
Yeah.
Whatever. So, like, it's really, really important to I think to strive to better understand those molecular flows.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I feel like we just scratched the surface. There's so much more to deepen here. But thank you so much for doing this live. Maybe we'll do it again sometime as a part 2. I definitely feel, yeah, I feel like I received a lot of insights through this conversation with you. And yeah, I'll put it on our page so people can listen. I can also put it on my YouTube as well if you want. And thank you so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me. It's really beautiful to take these conversations that we had and probably would have out, like, in private, but just bring them into the community, because collectivizing the experience, I think it's really beautiful, and I enjoy it as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, and I'll see you at another live.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me, Hadar.